Part A. The world made, the outlaw the feudal order, and the cracks within it in the year 100. If you were 100, if you were to look downward, if you were to look down upon from above, you would see a bun, you would see a land divided not by mountains or rivers alone, or her alone, by an invisible architecture of power. A pyramid of obligation, loyalty, and violence, the vehicle, the feudal system. At its apex sat the king, beneath him the great lords, then the lesser barons, the barons and knights, and the very base, the vast majority of the population. The serfs, the villeins, the cotters, men and women bound to the land, as surely as the oak trees that grew upon it. To understand how a man became an outlaw in medieval Europe, you must first understand what he was outlawed from. Understand the world he was born into, the rules that governed him, he broke them, and that's so often beyond the pale of law. The word outlaw itself carries the weight of its origins in Old English and Old Norse legal tradition. An outlaw was not merely a criminal. He was something far more precise and far more terrible, a man placed outside the law entirely. The Latin phrase vix lex, without law. To be declared outlaw was to be stripped of every legal possession he had. You could not thus justice. You could king's justice. You could not claim sanctuary in a church. If a man killed you on the road, he had no law, for the law did not acknowledge existence. You were, in the eyes of the medieval state, already dead. The wolf's head, caput lupinum, was the name given discontinuous, because like a wolf, the outlaw could be hounded by any man at any time, without consequence. This not an abstract legal concept. It was a lived reality. And everything about how outlaws survived, they hid, how long they lasted, and what they became. But to understand the outlaw, we must begin even earlier. We must begin with the peasant, with the villein, with the man who had yet broken any law, who still knelt at mass on Sunday morning and paid his dues to his Lord, and hoped, with the quiet desperation of the powerless, that the harvest would be good. The average peasant in medieval England or Orange or France lived in a vin of perhaps three households. His house was a one-room structure of wattle and daub with a thatched roof that leaked in winter and harbored in summers. Flussacs in summer. The floor was packed earth, strewn with rushes. There was no chimney in the earlier centuries. Smoke from the central hearth rose and drifted through a hole in the roof. or simply accumulated beneath the rafters, blackening everything, and slowly depoisoning the lungs of those who lived below. He slept on a straw pallet, possibly shared with his wife and John, and the coldest months with his lifestyles for the animals was Bordard he. Birthbull dark. Birkdener dawn. Before dawn, he worked until dark. He paid rent to his lord in labor. Typically, 3 days each week on the lord's mezzanine. The land reserved for the lord's personal use, and in kind, surrendering a portion of everything he grew everything he caught, everything he raised. He paid a fee when his daughter married. He paid a fee when he died, called the hiriot. When the lord's agents would come to his widow's door and take the best beast from the yard. He could not leave the village without permission, could not grind his grain at any mill but the lord's mill, where he was charged for the privilege. He could not hunt the deer that browsed the edge of his fields, for the beer belonged the king, and the forest that sheltered them was the king's forest, and to take so much as a rabbit from it without license was a crime, could cost hand or his eyes. This was the world from which outlaws were made, not always dramatic injustice. Though dramatic injustice certainly played its role, but often by the slow grinding weight of a system that left no margin for error. A failed harvest, a lord's arbitrary fine, a neighbor's false accusation, a debt that could not be repaid. These were the mechanisms that pushed men across the boundary between subject and exile, between the law's protection and its. The forest was the other world. In medieval Europe, the forest was not simply a cape. It was a zone of alterity, a realm beyond it, fields and fenced commons of the village, beyond the reach of the Lord's eye, and sometimes beyond the reach of his law. The great forests of England, Sherwood, Forest, the need created by William the Conqueror at terrible human cost, were enormous territories of royal ownership, subject to a separate body of law called forest law, which was among the most hated legislation of the medieval period. Forest law protected the vert and venison, the vegetation and the game, with a ferocity that bewildered and the common people. A peasant whose cow wandered into the king's forest and grazed on royal grass could be mutilated. A man who killed a deer to feed his starving children could be blinded and castrated. The forest was, in a very real sense, the king's private hunting ground. and maintained at enormous cost to the people who lived on its edges. Yet the forest was also freedom. It was the place you went when the village had become impossible, when the debt collector was at collector, or the sheriff's men were riding up the lane. Deep forest offered concealment. That open field system of medieval agriculture never could. Never could. A man who knew the forest, who knew its paths and water sources, its seasonal rhythms, and its dangerous animals, had advantages that armed pursuers on horseback did not. This is why the forest became the home of the outlaw, and why the outlaw became, in the popular ear, imagination, so intimately associated with the greenwood, with the canopy of oak and ash under which he made his fire and sharpened his arrows. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the life the outlaw led, we must understand how he became one. The roads to outlawry were many, and they are worth examining in detail, because they tell us about who were, and about who held power, who was vulnerable, and what happened when the gap between law and justice became too wide to bridge. Part 2. The making an outlaw crime decked conflict and the failure of justice. There was nihilo justice. There was no single face of the medieval outlaw. He, and it was almost always a he, though women too were sometimes outlawed, came from every stratum of society below the nobility. He might have been a runaway serf, merchant, a disgraced, a pardoned criminal who would slip back into old habits, a man wrongly accused and toozed, and too poor to afford mishigor hilari that might have exonerated him. The causes of outlawry were as varied as the people who fell into it. But patterns emerge with striking when we read the historical record. Was perhaps the most common engine of ruin in a society without banksy protection, without the legal concept of limited liability. A man who could repay had a huge delinquent sleeves that could spiral with terrible speed. Creditors could seize his goods, his livestock, even the tools he needed to work his land. They could claim his labor. In extreme cases, they could have him imprisoned. The method was general a means of coercion rather than punishment. You stayed until you paid for it or someone for you. And if no one came, you might simply die there. A man who saw his family in destitution and had no legal recourse might choose the forest or excel. That choice made him fugitive, and once he was a fugitive, the law gave him increasingly little reason to return. Violence was another engine. Medieval society was saturated with violence, in a ways is difficult for modern people appreciate. Disputes between neighbors, between families, lords and their vassals, were often resolved through force rather than law. And the line between legitimate self-defense and fence and criminal assault was frequently blurred. A man who killed another in a brawl, even if he had been the one attacked, might find himself facing trial in a court ed brand where the dead man's family had powerful connections, he had none. Acquittal was not guaranteed, and neither was a fair hearing. Flight was often the rational choice. The legal system itself was a source of outlawry. The process of being outlawed, pronounced ex lex, was the standard response to a defendant who failed to appear in court. You were summoned to the county court on 5 successive occasions. If you failed to appear each time, you were declared outlaw. This sounds simple and almost administrative, but the consequences were absolute. A man fate fair be peer, he genuinely did not know he had been summoned. He might fail to appear because he was ill, or because the roads were flooded, or because his lord had other plans for him that day. He might to appear because he was already a fugitive for some other reason and feared that showing up in court would end badly. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. He was outside the law. Political evil created previl and laws on a massive scale. When great lords fell from power, and turbulent, populent politics of medieval Europe fell, their retainers, their soldiers, and their tenants often fell with them. After the Norman conquest of 1066, of Anglo-Saxon thangs found themselves overnight. Their lands seized by Norman lords had never met them and cared nothing for their histories. Some of these dispossessed men melted into the forest. Some became the first English the outright tradition, the ancestors, in a sense, of Robin Hood after the reign of King John in England. Margaret Congen extradited him to Himkin Extratin in Tredward Sin 15th. The lords who had rebelled against him thinthast reprel and strofil and Iowan f outlawry and exile and outlawry. Every political crisis in medieval Europe generated a new crop of men for whom the law had become an instrument of oppression rather than protection. Religious minorities and heretics found themselves outside the law and did efferent devastating ways. A Jew who was accused of coin clipping, whether guilty or not. A fetzt. Not just legal jeopardy, but communal violence. A man accused of heresy, of following the teachings of the Cathars or the Waldensians or any dozens of movements the church condemned, faced Inquisition, and the Inquisition did not have outlawry in its toolkit. Excommunication, torture, and fire. But the effect was similar. Men ament poxide the community of law and a now protection from anything. Once a man had become an outlaw, his options narrowed with startling speed. He could not work openly in any trade or craft, because to do so would be to advertise his presence. He could not buy food in a market with risking recognition and capture. He could not sleep in an inn or seek shelter in a monastery or send his children to a village school. The Lord did not merely withdraw its protection from him, it actively recruited the entire population to pursue him. Every free man in England vitally obligated to participate in the in and cry, the organized pursuit of known criminals and fugitives. If you saw outlaw and did not raise the alarm, you could be fined. If you sheltered him, you could be outlawed yourself. This last point is crucial, and it is what makes the Socialist Five so fascinating. Despite the legal penalties, despot and analytes prevalence, proof imprudence, the common am shadow. The am fed them, warned them of approaching pursuers. For Kenner. Why? Because in many cases, the outlaw was their neighbor, their cousin, their former comrade. Because the law that had expelled him, not their law. Because they had seen the arbitrary cruelties of the legal system at first hand, and Nan had no reason to trust it. The outlaw lived in the forest, but he was sustained by the village, by the web of quiet solitude medieval communities wove against the demands of their superiors. This tension between the law's demand, cooperation, and the community's instinct for loyalty at the heart of the outlaw's story. Part 3. The daily life of outlawed, shelter, food, weapons, and the art of survival. Let us now enter the greenwood itself. Let us follow man in the first days of his outlawry. As he leaves the world he has known and attuned. To survive in the world he has entered. The transition was brutal and immediate. There was no preparation, no apprenticeship, no manual on how to be an outlaw. There was only the forest, the hunger, the cold, and the urgent need to stay alive. Shelter was the first necessity. The romantic image of the outlaw, the cozy woodland camp, with roaring fire and laughing companions, is largely a literary invention of later centuries. Real outlaws in the early medieval period lived in conditions that were far more desperate. In the warmer months, a simple lean-to of branches and leaves, or a hollow in a hillside, might first serve for sleeping. In winter, the same shelter that was merely uncomfortable in summer became genuinely life-threatening. Filled, frostbite, maimed, a man who went to sleep in wet clothes, illétisolated, in northern England, might not wake up. Outlaws developed sophisticated arrangements. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with outlaw activity. Though such evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. Since outlaws went to some trouble to avoid leaving permanent traces, suggests semi-permanent camps in dense woodland, often near streams for water and game, with structures that were substantial enough to withstand the winter, portable enough to be abandoned quickly if pursuers came close. Turf shelters, partially dug into hillsides, offered insulation that above-ground structures could not provide. Caves, where they were available, prized not just for their shelter, but for the defensive advantage of an entrance, of a single entrave, could observed and defended. Fire was both necessity and danger. You needed fire to cook, to stay warm, to drive away the insects that plagued woodland living. But fire produced smoke, and smoke could be seen for miles. And a column of smoke in an otherwise unpopulated forest was an immediate advertisement of human presence. Experienced outlaws learned to make small fires of dry wood that produced little smoke, to screen their fires with natural features of the landscape, and build the landscape, and to build them in hollows, or enclosures where the light would not carry. They learned to cook quickly and efficiently, to bank their fires at night, to read the wind. Rudets would not drift toward area. Fuiz was an Aerioshin challenge that never resolved itself into routine. The forest offered what it offered, and no more. In a good season, a man could easily weld from the wild. Venison, of course, was the iconic food of the outlaw. The poached deer that represented simultaneously his defiance, the king's law, and his access to that his peasant neighbors could only dream of. But killing a deer was not as simple as the ballads made it sound. Deer, quick, difficult to approach in silence. A medieval bow, a long bow of yew, perhaps 6 feet in length, required years of practice to use effectively. And the draw weights involved were enormous, often over 100 pounds, requiring arm, and shoulder strength that had to be developed over time. The poaching of deer was historically one of the most common reasons men was clan balls loved. The most common activities of men who were already outlaws. It formed a kind of circular logic. The forest law that mayor poaching, a serious crime, was one of the things that created outlaws. Then laws, and then those outlaws all stained themselves by doing exactly the thing that had made them outlaws. The historical records of the royal forests. The forest presents placements of foresters and verderers, full of prosecutions for exactly this kind of activity. Beyond venison, the outlaw's diet included rabbit, techleer, or manorial property, but smaller and more easily concealed, as well as wild boar, which was genuinely dangerous. Vers hunt without a group and equipment. Fish from rivers and streams preferred less alone. Since rivers less than game, wild plants, mushrooms, hazelnuts, wild garlic, blackberries, crab apples, crenurples of certain trees, supplemented a diet that was heavy on protein, but often deficient in carbohydrates. Grain was difficult to come by in the forest, but without that contact with the outside world, and contact with the outside world was always risky. This brings us the question of how outlaws obtained the things the forest could not provide: bread, salt, iron, leather, cloth. The answer was trade, theft, of support of sympathetic villagers, often in combinations that were deliberately obscured from the historical record. Archaeological evidence from medieval contexts suggests that eagle trading networks were sophisticated and extensive. Outlaws would approach trusted individuals: a miller who ground grain at odd hours for unknown customers, a blacksmith who repaired tools without asking where they came from, a widow who left bread and cheese at the edge of the forest at night, and through these intermediaries obtain what they needed. The providers were taking real risks, but they were also often compensated with game. with a small share of anything the outlaws had taken from wealthier targets. Weapons were a defining feature of the outlaw's life, and they deserve careful examination because disturb Mississippi from image. The longbow is the most famous weapon with English outlaws, and for good reason. Were the English and Welsh peasant and yeoman classes, tenif, unbenough to own, but formidable enough to kill at long range. A skilled archer with a warbow could shoot 12 aimed arrows per minute, each capable of hitting chainmail up to 200 yards. The skills required were developed from childhood. Thus the range from sport fishing, the syringe of clear as bowhunters, of sprouters from years of practice, clear evidence of how central lives, certain men's lives, from a very young age. But the bow, not the only weapon in the outlaw's arsenal. Or quarterstaff, a hardwood pole 8 feet, was the universal weapon of the common man. It required no metallurgy, no metallurgy, no specialism of screen, no years of expensive training. Anyone could pick up a stick. Not everyone could use it effectively, but a strong man with a staff was a dangerous opponent, even for an armored knight on foot. The sword, by contrast, was largely beyond the reach of the common outlaw. Swords were expensive. A good sword, as much as several weeks for and their ownership was, in many medieval jurisdictions, leastly restricted. Certain social status. An outlaw carrying a sword was advertising his theft of it or his violation of sumptuary law, or both. Knives were universal. Every man in medieval Europe carried a knife. It was essential a tool as a hand, used for eating, for rope, for leather and wood, and incidentally, for defense. The outlaw's knife, larger than a tool designed for butchering game as well as more violent purposes. The falchion, a single-edged cutting sword somewhere between a basin and a short snort. Appears frequently in outlaw narratives and was plausible as outlaw equipment, precisely because it was cheaper than a true sword, and could be explained as a tool as easily as a weapon. The day of an experienced outlaw in a functioning band had a rhythm to it, shaped by the seasons and the demands of survival. Mornings were movement and reconnaissance, checking snares the night before, scouting the paths and tracks leading to the camp. E-camp, assessing the wind and weather. Midday, if food had been found. For rest, who were constantly active, were outlaws who made noise. Afternoons might involve the long, patient work of the scouting of roads and paths where rat paths, travelers might pass, or the maintenance of equipment. Evenings were for the fire, for food, for whatever conversation, and the group could manage. Nights were for sleep, but sleep that was always light, always alert to sounds that did not belong. The snap of a branch, the jingle of a harness. Dogs. Of dogs. Part EV. Outlawed, the outlawla, hierarchy, loyalty. Loyalty, the social order, of the Greenwood solitary outlawry, was a death sentence. The lone man in the forest, without companions to watch, perforce for pursuers. Share their when ninin. Provide care when illness, injury, and the basic human support that kept sane did not last long. The historical record on individual is sparse on individuals alones who survived alone. It is rich with accounts of bands, gangs, companies of men had chosen in Holland or Brabant, driven in together, and who maintained their existence through collective action. The outlaw band was a small society, like all small societies at hierarchies. These hierarchies did not always mirror those of the world the outlaws had left behind. In the forest, what mattered was competence. The man who could shoot the straightest, read the forest, plow accurately, plan the most successful raids, negotiate most effectively with the outside world, was the natural leader, regardless of his birth. This is one of the genuinely interesting features of outlaw communities. They were, by necessity, meritocratic in ways that medieval society at large was not. Leadership in an outlaw band was not simply a matter of strength or violence. Both played their role. It required a specific kind of intelligence. The ability to assess risks accurately, to plan operations that achieved their goals without unnecessary exposure, to err, to manage the competing needs and temperaments of the men in the group, and to maintain the external relationships. Sympathetic. Villagers with contacts in nearby towns, with men's, or provide information about upcoming opportunities that kept the band alive. The leaders who survived in the historical record were men of genuine organizational talent. Below the leader, the band's internal structure was typically informal but not random. Certain men had specific skills that elevated their status. The exceptional archer, the man who knew the forest intimately, the forestry from Incares Poirier, the foraging before was outlawed, the former soldier, military experience gained him tactical knowledge the others lacked. The man with contacts in a nearby town, who could obtain information and supplies. These men were not officers in any formal sense, but they had influence, and the wise leader cultivated their loyalty rather than attempting to override it. Conflict within the band was one of its dangers. A group of men living in close quarters, under constant stress, competing for limited resources of food and warmth and comfort. A group, lightly, on the edge of violence. The ballads and romances of the later medieval period are full of tests of loyalty within outlaw bands. The new member, must prove himself, the traitor who sells his companions to the authorities. The dispute over the division of spoils threatens to tear the group apart. These literary merry motifs rift real social pressures. Historical records show outlaw bands betrayed by their own members with some regularity, and the punishments meted out to traitors within such groups were swift and severe. The induction of new members was a matter of genuine consequence. An outlaw band was only as secure as its most untrustworthy member. And admit someone who bit flutes, either for a promised pardon or out of fear, could mean death for everyone. New members were therefore observed carefully, tested in small ways before being trusted, and expected to demonstrate their commitment through actions that made lawful society of fault impossible. A man who had participated in a robbery, whose name was associated advocacy of activity, had less incent effect than a man who had merely shared for a night. Women in outlaw bands occupy an interesting space in both the historical record and the literary tradition. The romantic image, the beautiful in the forest, loved the outlaw leader, exists in numerous ballads and stories, and it is not entirely without historical basis. Women sometimes outlawed themselves, though less frequently than men, and women sometimes lived with outlaw bands by choice or necessity. The role of women in maintaining the outlaw's connection to the village community. A woman of family connections in a nearby settlement could serve as an intermediary passing information in ways that a known outlaw law could not. The band's relationship with the surrounding community, perhaps complex, and most important of its social existence. An outlaw band that preyed indiscriminately on the local peasant, who had little to who had little to lose in the sheriffs to gain. The bands that lasted, that appear repeatedly in there over periods of years or even decades, maintained a careful distinction between their targets. The rich, full, the representatives of the dance lyrics, Gefrep, the Gistlau, the corrupt officials, and their protectors, the common people, who sheltered them, fed them. This distinction was not always maintained. Records, plenty of outlaw bands terrorized communities around them as thoroughly as any lord's enforcers. But those bands tended to collapse more quickly. Vijalal elistant yalan that evening Orwell Danton long withstand. The bands that achieved mythological status, that were remembered, and stories were those that seemed to embody a kind of rough justice that struck at the oppressors rather than the oppressed. Whether any actual outlaw band lived up to this image, almost impossible to say. What mattered was that the image enough and the aspiration real enough. Both the behavior of actual outlaws and the stories about them. Part V. The outlaw, the land law, and law pardoned, the machinut, and a machinery of justice. The relation between the medieval outlaw and the legal system was not a simple opposition and authority. It was a dynamic, constantly shifting negotiation. Boyle, the other, needed. The law needed the outlaw's submission, or failing that, his death, to demonstrate that no man was truly beyond its reach. The outlaw needed the law's mercy, the royal pardon, to escape the perpetual insecurity of life outside its protection. This mutual need shaped the outlaw's existence in ways that are often overlooked in more romantic accounts. The royal pardon was the outlaw's most coveted object. It was not a legal fiction. It was real document issued under the king's seal that restored the outlaw to legal existence and erased, at least formally, the crimes he had been expelled. Pardoned. Pardons were available, and their They were granted with some regularity, but they were not free. They required payment, political connections, or, most commonly in wartime, military service. The King's Wars in France, in Scotland, in Wayland, in Ireland, provided regular opportunities for outlaws. Their rehabilitation through blood. A man who served in the King's army petitioned for pardon, and the petition was granted. The service had been honorable. It had created a fascinating social dynamic. The same king who had declared a man outlaw might, views later, be paying that to fight his enemies. The same sheriff had been pursuing a band of outlaws. The forest might be recruiting them for a campaign in France. The military skills that outlaws developed, the archery, the ability to move quickly, terrain, the experience with ambush and hit and run attacks. See, this skill that medieval warfare required. There is historical evidence that commanders actively sought out men with outlaw grounds for service in the infantry. In Lecken recognizing that their unconventional experience in ways values in ways that conventional recruits were not. The process of seeking a pardon required the outlaw to a complex legal and bureaucratic landscape while remaining hidden from the very authorities he was. He was trying to petition. He needed an intermediary, a church, a search official, a sympathetic lord, a legal representative who could approach the royal chancery on his behalf and begin the process of negotiating terms. The price of a pardon varied enormously, depending on the severity of the crimes, the climate, the wealth of the petitioner, and the mood of the king. Poor men who had committed minor crimes taint pardons cheaply. Notorious of criminals with long records of violence against powerful interests might tame them at all. The pursuit of outlaws was, from the law's perspective, an ongoing administrative challenge. The sheriff was the primary instrument of authority, and each county, and the pursuit of outlaws was among the responsibilities. He could call out the pos comitatus, the collective military force of the county, to pursue known outlaws, and he could offer rewards for information leading to their capture. But the sheriff's resources were limited. His territory was Borıng, and the forest was not his home. Sheriffs who pursued outlaws progressively into deep woodland often found themselves in tactical situations that favored they were chasing. The foresters, the officers responsible for policing the royal forests, were the outlaw's most persistent antagonists on a day-to-day basis. These were men who knew the forest almost as well as the outlaws themselves, who had informers among the local, and who were sufficiently motivated by the risk of losing their jobs and their reputations to poachers the genuine commitment. The forester appears frequently in outlaw law ballads as a villain, and not merely literary convention. The forester, the phase D, his forest law, the man who showed up, prosecute families for the crime of letting their pigs wander far and into royal woodland. The relationship between the church and the outlaw, and complex and sometimes paradoxical. The church offered sanctuary. Any fugitive who reached the threshold of a church and claimed the right of sanctuary could not legally be removed for 40 days. This was an important safety valve in the legal system. Reg not initialize just, and that in that if the guilty deserved time to consider their options, an outlaw in sanctuary could negotiate from a position of temporary safety, could make arrangements for voluntary exile rather than trial, could send messages to potential intermediaries about the terms on which he might surrender. But the church also created the executive of heretics and pursuing heretics. The boundary between the two jurisdictions, as was constantly contested. A bishop who sheltered an outlaw openly could find himself in conflict with the crown. A king who violated sanctuary too flagrantly could find himself in conflict with Rome. These tensions shaped individual cases in ways could be either helpful or harmful to the outlaw, depending specific licital circumstances and the degree to which his case had attracted high-level attention. Torture was not officially part of the English common law tradition in a way was in European ilia, Hetherian in Enulus. At least, Ili, in theory, relied on the jury trial rather than the confession extracted by paid. But this formal distinction masked a great deal of informal brutality. Outlaws who were captured were frequently subjected to violence before and during interrogation, were held in conditions that constitute the form of torture through deprivation, and were executed in ways calculated to maximize their suffering as at others. To others, hanging, drawing, and quartering, the full penalty for treason. involved being hanged until nearly 8, nearly dead, disemboweled while still living, and then beheaded, cut it into 4 pieces, with whips in public places was as a warning. This was not a routine punishment for ordinary outlaws. For those crimes had risen to the level of treason, it was a very real possibility. The execution of outlaws who were caught served a social function, punishment. It was theater, deliberately staged and performed. The hanging at the crossroads, the laid decate, quartered Kate, the fordered Bensis and fuse words, tongues, communications, messages from the state to the population about the fate that awaited those who defied its authority. And they were messages that were received and understood, even as they were sometimes also resented. Even as the crowds that dodge to watch execution sometimes found themselves in sympathy with the condemned rather than with the executioner. Parts VIs. Seasons of the outlaw: winter heart, summer shimmy, summer abundance, and the rhythms year. The life of the medieval outlaw, profoundly shaped by the seasons in a way that is difficult for modern people. Insulated from the natural world by technology, to fully appreciate. The difference between summer and winter was not a difference in comfort. It was a different. It went between genuine and mortal danger. Understanding how outlaws navigated the calendar year is essential to understanding how they survived at all. Spring came as salvation after the hardest months. The return of leaves to the trees restored the cover that the outlaw depended on. The emergence of game from the deeper forest, deer to proving to browse on new growth, rabbits appearing on south-facing slopes, meant food was more readily available. Wild plants returned. The first nettles that could be boiled into a rough soup. The wood, sorrel, and hawthorn leaves that provided nutrients after months of a meat-heavy diet. The streams ran full of fish as the snow melted from the hills. A band that had survived winter was a band strengthened by survival, hardened by the experience, and grateful for the abundance of spring. But spring also brought renewed risk. The authorities were more active in the warmer months, when the warmlands travel was easier and the roads passable. The posse comitatus more easily assembled when men were not needed every hour for the survival tasks of winter and the thin cover of early spring, when the leaves in the leaves with that mullur sawyer surser. Made the weeks between winter and full summer a dangerous transitional period. Experienced outlaws knew to keep low in March and April, to avoid exposed positions, to move to only when the foliage was dense enough to provide real concealment. Summer was the best time. The forest was at its most hospitable, its most productive, its most concealing. The days were long. The nights Swartworth and warm. Food was plentiful, and as canopy, and it was sanibence that a group of men moving through. It was virtually invisible to anyone more than a few yards away. This was the season for bolder action, for raids on roads and manors and manor houses, for recruiting new members, for an semi-budgetenbers for the campaign against the Robin Hood ballads, capture in their feasting in the greenwood. Whether any outlaw band ever actually lived like that is mkdut. The image captures in singing out summer as the season of maximum confidence and capability. Autumn. Autumn was a time of preparation. The harvest was in progress, which meant movement of grain and goods along the roads, which meant opportunities for those who preyed on such movement. But it also meant the beginning of the race against winter. The need to accumulate stores, to repair or relocate shelters, to obtain the equipment, extra blanks, preserved food, fought at cut, stacked, that would make the difference between when saving when not, and not. An outlaw band that went into winter underprepared as a band was a band that would spend January and February desperate, taking forays into inhabited areas to obtain what they needed, which was exactly the kind of activity most likely to get them caught. Winter was the great equalizer. The forest stripped bare of leaves became transparent, revealing to any observer the smoke of fires, the tracks snow, the dark shapes of moving men against white ground. The cold was relentless and cumulative. A few warm days might follow a week of hard frost, and the alternation of freeze-thaw was particularly brutal, since wet clothing that froze on a body overnight caused injuries that reduced a man's effectiveness for days or weeks. Frostbite was common, respiratory, what medieval people called the cold, which might have been anything from a mild infection to pneumonia. Kilmunia killed men who had otherwise survived everything the forest virus had to offer. Not singling a matter of comfort. Fire was survival. Fatver was visible. and an at large band of large 500 menner, and as in ambitious virist, every forester, every informer, every ambitious villain, who might have fire about the sheriff's reward. The solution was to make fire only when necessary, to make it small. Available. Some outlaw bands, based on the historical evidence, maintained semi-permanent winter camps in locations that offered natural insulation, caves, earthworks, densely overgrown ravines, where the structural warmth of the earth itself supplemented whatever fire they could make. Illness was the hidden killer of medieval outlaw existence. Then a desertion, then romantic counts. Give it. A man who broke his leg in a forest fox from the nearest settlement might not have died, might die from infection, but from infection, from exposure during the days before help arrived, from the inadequate nutrition, slowed his healing. That slowed his healing. A man developed nepses in his cess, in his tooth on his skin, in his gut, had no access to the surgical or pharmaceutical interventions that might have saved him. The average life expectancy of medieval peasants was low enough. Expectancy of outlaws exposed to greater physical risk, greater rulers, and access to any form of medical care was lower still. The medical knowledge available in a functioning medieval outlaw band of medicine. The use of plants known to have antiseptic, analgesic, or wound-closing properties. The application of feet and pressure to injuries, the management of fever through rest and hydration. Some of this knowledge was genuinely effective. Willow bark, which contains the compound from which aspirin is derived, was known for its fever-reducing properties. Yarrow and plantain were used to staunch bleeding. Honey, which has genuine antibacterial properties, was sometimes used on wounds, but the gap between fumat oni and list retflyers and the unders martyr regrounds marmots mend England trivial inklings day te pertry outlaw economy robbery trade and the underground markets of medieval England. Outlaw had to eat. He had to clothe himself, maintain his obtains salt and iron, then iron, the 100 other small necessities that the forest did not provide. The question of how he obtained these things, beyond hunting and foraging, opens a window onto one of the least studied aspects of medieval social history. the underground economy, the informal markets, the networks of trade and mutual aid that existed in the shadows of the official economic order. Highway robbery was the most visible and most dramatic aspect of outlaw economics. And it is the most prominent, most in tradition. The image of the bold outlaw stepping out from behind a tree to the front vertiet demand the churchman demandings ing his gold with the throw of a arrow is one of the most enduring in popular culture, and it was real. Highway robbery was endemic in medieval Europe. Particularly on the roads, through forested areas, and in royal records, in royal plamations, in chronicles, and in legal pregil proceedings with sufficient frequency to establish it as a genuine social phenomenon rather than a literary invention. But the practicalities of highway robbery were considerably more complicated than the ballads suggest. A successful robbery required intelligence. You need to know that a valuable target was going to be on a particular road at a particular time, traveling with an escort small enough to be overcome or intimidated. This intelligence came from the centric villager and town contacts that provided the outlaw with food and shelter. An innkeeper who noticed a wealthy merchant staying the night observed the size, escort, and the weight of his baggage. Sent word to his contact in the forest was performing a service for which he might expect compensation and which he took considerable personal risk. The robbery itself required coordination. Lone man stepping ab a merchant's train, but men, dead band, if the merchant any significant escort. Successful highway robbery required multiple men minimum, positioned and Gartford with a clear the note and vowel and could not follow. The skills involved were military skills. Positioning, timing, contriving, controlled aggression sufficient to overwhelm without necessarily killing. A crime to a capital offense, more serious than simple theft. Knoll robbery was the dramatic ambush of the ballads. Burglary, that the theft of goods from buildings, was more common and immediate, and in some ways more, though it required different skills and carried different risks. A manor house with deuced staff during the Lord's Abbot's absence was a tempting target. A merchant's warehouse on the edge of a town offered goods that could be taken, could do without the direct confrontation of highway robbery. The historical record, outlaw bands engaged in a wide variety of property crimes. Twiller, the mundane, pending, in an opportunities present themselves.
How
Desperate their need, the disposal of stolen goods was a challenge that required its best knowledge and contacts. A man in possession of a silver chalice or a bolt of expensive in the middle of a forest, not simply walk into the nearest market and sell it. The goods might be recognized, might carry identifying marks, might attract exactly the kind of attention that could lead to capture and execution. The medieval equivalent of the fence, the receiver of goods, was an essential figure in the outlaw economy. These individuals, who might be smiths or tanners or small traders in legitimate life, maintained relationships with outlaw bands that were mutually dangerous. Some outlaw bands developed what they called parackets, arrangements with local merchants, millers, or alurcher or verses, whereby the outlaws agreed not to rob them in exchange for regular payments of goods or information. The historical evidence for such arrangements is necessarily the parties involved had every reason to keep them secret. Court records, when things went wrong, when the arrangement broke down, when one of the parties was arrested, and decided to tell what they knew, the logic was entirely sensible from both sides. The merchant avoided the risk of robbery and potentially useful information about other outlaws who might target him. The outlaw obtained regular income without the risk of active robbery. The economic relationship between outlaw bands and the peasant communities around them were complex still. The image of the outlaw who robs from the rich and gives to the poor is a later literary reconstruction. It contains a kernel of truth in the sense that outlaw bands that wanted to maintain local support had to offer something in return for the shelter, food, emurine. The community provided. What they offered was sometimes goods taken from outside the community, from the merchant or the tax collector, the tax collector, distributed below market prices, or simply given away. Sometimes it was protection. A band of armed men in the vicinity was a deterrent to them of other criminal groups or abusive local officials. Sometimes it was simply the unspoken understanding that those who who helped would not be among those robbed. Money, where outlawed, flowed through these same underground channels. Coins in robbery were valuable, but dangerous to spend. Dangerous so gager by loon fugith or his associates would immediately attract attention. They needed to be either spent at a distance through immerse, ordered, or hoarded against the day of a possible pardon, when they might be used to pay the legal and bureaucratic costs of rehabilitation. The outlaw's relationship with money, Wangni, was therefore necessarily indirect and frustrating. He might have significant certain coin at certain moments, but spending it freely was a risk he could rarely afford to take. Part Booter. The outlaw in culture and my th Robin Hood. Hereward the Wake. The medieval outlaw, did not only in the forest, he lived in the imagination of the people around him. And in that imaginative space, he was transformed into something larger than individual man good could be. The literary and folkloric tradition of the outlaw in medieval Europe is vast, varied and deeply revealing of the social tensions, relunt laws in the first place. To understand how the outlaw was imagined is to understand something essential about the society that imagined him. The earliest English outlaw legend of any significant scope concerns Hereward, known to later tradition as the Wake, the touchful, suggesting a quality of vigilance and alertness that the legendary outlaw law required. Hereward was a historical figure. N. Earlsa then who led resistance against the Norman conquest in the fenlands of eastern England in the early 70s based at the Isle of Ely, a fortified position in the marshy landscape that the Normans found extremely difficult to assault. He appears in contemporary chronicles as a genuine military scale in the gear relat. The fens favored, supported by Danish allies, and by the team, timed to Norman rule. By the 12th century, Hereward had already begun an historical figure to legend. Stories accrued to his name of miraculous from Norman captivity, disguises him past him without recognition, feats of arms so extraordinary that they could only be explained by divine favor or supernatural ability. The kernel of historical truth was surrounded by the barnacles of folk narrative. and the result was a figure who stood for something more any individual man could embody. That embody the defiant native against the foreign oppressor, the man of the people against the alien aristocracy. Robin Hood is the most famous outlaw of the Hebrew world, and his to history is considerably more complex than either's it is and or lease went usually acknowledged. The earliest Robin Hood ballads, A Jest of Robin Hood, and The Monk, Robin Hood, and Guy of Gisborne, date to the late 14th and early 15th centuries, but they clearly draw on older materials and older traditions. The Robin of these early ballads is no noble Earl of Huntingdon of later Elizabethan and Victorian. He is a yeoman, a man of middling social status, a skilled old archer whose social world is that of the forest and the road, not the castle and the court. The early Robin Hood is interestingly because of what he is not. He is not a dispossessed aristocrat, not a crusader come home to find his estates stolen, not a romantic hero whose lawlessness is a temporary aberration in an otherwise respectable life. He is a professional outlaw, a man whom the forest is home and robbery is occupation, whose relationships are with other outlaws and with the yeomen and peasants who support him, whose enemies are the Sheriff of Nottingham, the representative of royal law, and the corrupt churchmen who abuse their economic power over the poor. He represents Pacific and can this that the law practiced serves the powerful, the expense of the weak, and that a man of good character is more likely to find justice outside the law than within it. This critique had particular resonance in the late 14th and Artvliebel, because there was the intent 10th and ancient in England. The Black Death had killed between and a half of the English population in the middle of the century, disrupting the labor supply and that gave peasants unprecedented bargaining power. Power that the nobility tried to roll back through legislation in the Statute of Laborers, which attempted wages at pre-plague levels. The Peasants' Revolt of 1481, the most significant popular uprising in England medieval history, expressed the social tensions that the Robin Hood ballads dramatized: resentment of corrupt officials, anger at the abuse of legal processes by a demand for for justice that the existing system to provide. The ballads, in other words, were not escapist entertainment, though they were certainly entertaining. They were also planetary, also Velsen, and were expressing views at justice and power that were widespread and deeply felt, but could not be stated directly without risk. The outlaw in the forest, making his own justice with his own bow, was a sea of resistance. People who had very few other outlets for their frustration. The sheriff who was outwitted, the corrupt abbot, who is robbed and humiliated, the king who meets Robin in the forest and is charmed by his honest service. These are not random characters, but good, carefully chosen representatives of the institutions weighed most heavily on ordinary people's lives. Continental Europe had its own outlaw traditions, which certain features with the English while reflecting their specific contexts. The French traditions of brigand and the routier, the free soldier who had been demobilized from one of the endemic Wardic wars of the period, turned to robbery, were darker, and the English sides, Brunelias, than the English Greenwood tradition, reflecting the greater devastation that the 100 Years' War and related conflicts in the French country. The brigand was feared more than he was loved. His legend contained less of the redistributus of Robin Hood, and more of pure terror of armed men. Had nothing to lose. In Germany, the robber occupied a similar cultural space, with legendary figures associated with specific forests and regions becoming coal points, local identity and resistance. The Schwald, and other great German forests, their own outlaw heroes, their own stories of men who lived out society's rules, challenged its injustices. These figures were often explicitly associated with older, pre-Christian traditions. The forest as the realm of the wild hunt, the outlaw as a man and gun, Lomela, Momo relationship with the natural world that Christianity and feudalism had tried to suppress. What all these traditions share across national and linguistic boundaries is a specific emotional register. The outlaw is always someone who has been wronged before he wrongs others. Always someone whose violence is reactive rather than simply predatory. Always someone whose skills and courage earn him a grudging respect, even from those whose
him.
This emotional template It reflects the real social function of an outlaw legend to allow two communities to process their resentment of power out actually challenging it, to maintain the fantasy of justice, even when the reality was quite different. Part X. Women, the outlaw world, female outlaws, outlaw wives, and hidden outwives. The hidden histories, the history of women in connection with medieval outlawry has been and largely invisible, written out of both the formal legal record and the literary tradition. Outlaws. But women's seven and now outlaws. And women were present at every stage of the outlaw's world. As outlaws themselves, as the partners and family members of outhunt men, as the village contacts without whom outlaw bands could not have survived, and as the witnesses to events that the official record was not designed to capture. Women outlawed less frequently than men, but immune to the process. The legal mechanism was slightly different. A woman could not technically be made outlaw in the same formal sense, since she was not considered fully the law in the way that men were. Instead, she could be waived or declared a waif, meaning she lost the minimal legal protections she had possessed. The practical consequences were similar. A woman who had been waived was without legal recourse, could not sue in court, and had lost whatever slim protections the law had offered her. The circumstances that led women to be outlawed or waived were her and helped her lows of demand in their lives. A wife helped her outlawed husband, who was fed him, sheltered him, passed an information to him, was technically accessory to his crimes, and could face legal penalties, including waiving. This put women in an impossible position. The law demanded that they betray their husbands or face the same consequences, while loyalty and love and simple self-interest all pointed in the opposite direction. The historical record shows that most women chose loyalty and faced the consequences. Some women became outlaws through their own independent actions. Female thieves in the courts of every period and region, female receivers of stolen goods, pickety, requirers of intelligence and Cock's willingness to take risks, but not when some regularity, women who practiced illegal trades, brewing, unlicensed he-shilling, could find themselves on the wrong side of the law in that led toward outlawry if they persisted, or were unlucky enough to face particularly aggressive enforcement. The women who had been left alone by a man's outlawry faced particular hardships. Hardships. If her husband had been outlawed, he'd been outlawed. His property was legally forfeited, which meant the widow and children were left destitute. She could not sue to recover anything because should in court claim legal standing without admitting her relationship with the outlaw. She might be subjected to demands from the Lord to reveal her husband's whereabouts, demands backed by the threat of eviction. Or worse, the village community was often her only source and the solidarity that the village extended to the families of outlaws was among the most important social facts of the medieval period, even though it is barely visible in the official record. The outlaw's wife or partner who maintained contact with him between the forest and the village was taking enormous risks. The legal penalty for aiding a known outlaw was outlawry itself. And this was not merely a theoretical threat. The court records show prosecutions for exactly this activity, with women sometimes receiving harsh sentences. Yet activity continued because the need was real. The outlaw needed information about the movements of his pursuers, about changes in the legal situation that might affect his chances of a pardon, about the health and safety of his family. The woman in the village was his intelligence network, his supply line, his connection to the human world. In the literary tradition, women associated with outlaws falls into a small number of recurring types. There is the loyal wife or lover whose devotion sustains the outlaw through the hardships of forest life, and whose own sufferings at the hands of the astro. These dramatize the cruelty of the system. There is the treacherous woman whose outlaw his enemies. His enemies is presented as ultimate treachery, a violation of personal bonds of loves of brout able break, to be able to break. And there is the woman disguised as a man who joined Lincoln and Joe will band and her own right and proves herself equal or superior to the male outlaws in courage, a type that appears in English ballads, in friendly valets, romance, and in various continental traditions. These literary types aren't precisely because they are types. They are types. They reduce the lifelessness of women's involvement in outlaw life to simple, legible narrative functions. The real women behind these figures were considerably more varied. Some were loyal and some were not. Some were courageous and some were refined. Bad, some actively chose the outlaw life, and some had it thrust upon them. What they shared was the experience of navigating a legal and social system that gave them very little power and demanded much of them, and doing sources with whatever resources, intelligence, courage, and social connection they could muster. The archaeology of outlaw sites is give of reference of must that the written record obscures textile fragments, tools associated with the domestic work, evidence of sphynxing is associated with female labor. These material traces suggest that women were present in out camp, more often outlaws than are outlaws. And chronicles indicate the outlaw band was not on always an exclusively male world. Who performed it, took their own risks, and made their own choices. Part X. The end of outlawry capture. Pardon, dear. And Parlin D. death? In the legacy of every outlaw's story, it ended in one of a small number of ways. He died in the forest, from violence or illness or the slow attrition of a life lived too hard. He was captured and executed, his head displayed on a city gate as a warning to others. Hanged, he a pardon and returned to legal life, perhaps with a new name and a new start in a different part of the country. He simply disappeared from the record, his fate unrecorded by authorities who with larger concerns. Or, most rarely, he achieved the kind of legendary status that in him all restables. A living symbol of resistance, whose capture would create more trouble than it solved. Capture was the most common ending for outlaws whose names appear in the historical record. Simply, those who were captured left traces, while those who died quietly in the forest. The process of capture enormously. Some outlaws tendency and finfintation when their band had been cornered or subcornered, surprised by a larger force. Some were betrayed by Confederates who had decided that the reward for information was more valuable than loyalty. Some were recognized in towns or villas while attempting to conduct the business that the forest could not provide for, and were seized by local officials or by citizens hoping to claim the reward. Imprisonment following capture was not always as straightforward as it might appear. Medieval prisons were not the sophisticates of later centuries. They were typically the cellars or towers of castles or monasteries, secured cigargs, and guards that were imperfect. And there are numerous historical examples of outlaw prisoners escaping before trial or execution. The famous escape stories in the Borıng, Robin breaking out of Nottingham Castle, the rescue of Will Scarlet from the gallows, reflect a real phenomenon. The outlaw community had every incentive to attempt rescue, and then the medieval prison was not always secure enough to prevent it. Execution, when it came, was spectacular. The hanging at the crossroads served multiple functions. It was punishment, deterrent, and demonstration of the state's power to bring even the most elusive outlaw to justice. For notorious outlaws, the execution was an event. Crowds gathered. Ballads were sometimes composed to commemorate the occasion. And the damned man had the opportunity for a final speech, might achieve a kind of retrospective dignity. The tradition of the gallows confession was important in medieval culture. What you said at the moment of death was presumed to be true. And the condemned man who maintained his innocence or articulated artindressness, that is, that had driven him to outlawry influence how he was remembered. The pardon, the happy ending that the ballads preferred, and was the entirely iffy is the royal records of medieval England contain numerous examples of who've obtained pardons and returned to the life. The process was often long, expensive, and dependent on factors beyond the outlaw's control, the king's mood, the political priorities of the moment, the potential allies. But it happened. Men spent at professorial villages. Sometimes the new Stalinists, those they had wronged themselves. Symes was with military service to their credit that gave them public public respect. What happened to a pardoned outlaw after his return turned to legal society? The question, it is rarely asked, and the answer is not always happy. Happy. A man who had been outside the law for years had lost his property, his legal standing, and often his family connections. He had acquired skills and habits at Hekesselingly held world of the village or the town. He had enemies who bore him genuine grievances, who were not legally prevented from seeking private satisfaction. Some pardoned outlaws found they were the forest life. Because they were forced there, because it was the only world they knew. The ending of the era of the great outlaw, in English history, is usually dated to this stated the strengthening of royal administration in the late medieval period. The development of more effective court systems, more reliable mechanisms for the enforcement of the gradual erosion, the vast areas of ungoverned forest that provided the outlaw's primary. But this administrative was slower and more uneven. The note text. Outlawry remained a real social phenomenon into the 16th and 18th and beyond. It simply different forms as the landscape and the law changed. The legacy of the medieval outlaw in Western culture is enormously complex. The tradition of the noble outlaw, the man driven outside of the law by injustice, who maintains his essential goodness and eventually earns the returns to redeem himself through heroic action, is one of the most persistent narratives in literature and film. From the medieval ballads to the Elizabethan stage to the Victorian novel, to the Western marine movie, to the reaction film, outways. The outlaw hero and reappears, weighs well, always carrying the same emotional charge. The promise, one man, armed with courage and skill and an innate sense of justice, can resist the power, institutions, and survive. This is powerful fancy. All powerful fantasies, it tells us something true about the world, generates it. Was society unusually unjust in ways that the people living in it recognized and resented? The laws was, yes, an instrument of the powerful against the weak, as often as it was a protection of the weak against the powerful. The sheriff really was corrupt sometimes. The abbot really did abuse his economic position. The king's forest law really was maintained and enormous cost to people who had no voice in its creation. The outlaw who defied all of this war, in whom the powerless could invest their resistance with resistance. And those fantasies were not merely fades, they were a form of social knowledge, an understanding of the system's contradictions that that's official culture hard to suppress. The man who stepped out from behind the Hinge Road in medieval England was not a hero belled. He was hungry, cold, frightened, and dangerous. He had people depending on him whose survival required his continued liberty. He had enemies. With the law on their side and resources, he could not. He lived by his wits and the support of people who took risks his behalf they had not chosen and did not entirely understand. He was, in the most, a man outside the world, outside its protections and outside its rules. Arrangements, making his own arrangements with reality, the shadow of the great forest, under the cover of leaves that fall at autumn and leave him exposed, that I would come again in spring and shelter him once more. That would continue their ancient cycle long. Was gone. Epilogue. Remembering ye greenwood. What greenwood? What outlaw left behind? We have come the long way from the one-room house, a smoky hearth, from the dawn departure into old nothing, but a bow and an empty stomach. We have followed the medieval outlaw through the legal mechanisms that created him, the daily challenges of survival in the greenwood, the social world, the world of the band, and its complex, relaxed relationships with the community beyond the trees, the underground economy that sustains him, and the cultural imagination that transformed him into legend. Even while he lived, what remains across the centuries is something more than a romantic image. It is of historical truths about power, justice, and survival that are more relevant than they might for it. Peer. The medieval outlaw existed because the gap between law and law was real and wide and experienced by real people in real ways. It existed because the forest was a refuge that society could not fully control. He existed because communities have always found ways to support those whose expulsion official structures they considered unjust. He existed because the skills required for survival outside the law are also skills through real effort, worthy of respect, however we judge the purposes to which they were put. The man in the greenwood, whoever he was, whatever specific crime or injustice or of accident of circumstance had placed him there, was a product of his world in the most complete sense. He carried its prejudices and its values, even as he defied its rules. He fought for his survival using the knowledge to as society had given him. In the landscape that his society had shaped and claimed and tried to control. He is as much of the medieval world as the cathedral, the monastery, or the tournament. As much a part of it as plague or harvest or the long winter And in the stories were told about him in the taverns and around the fires of villages whose names have been forgotten, in the ballads that have come down to us, manuscripts made copy by caravans. Something of their fair reality was preserved that the official record could not capture. The texture of his life, the quality of his the emotional truth of a world in which justice and law were not always the same thing, and in which a man who stood outside the law might still stand, somehow, on the side of what was right. The leaves fall in Sherwood every autumn, and every spring bring they return. Oaks that sheltered generation after generation of those who had nowhere else to go still stand in places older than any document, and older than any record, witnesses to a history that is only partly written. The greenwood remains in the imagination, if not always in relief. The spectworth out defiant have always gone when the world's rules have become intolerable. The place where if you are skilled enough and lucky enough and supported by people who believe in you, you might survive.